UI. As you can see here, we have UI Select, which is an AngularJS native version of Select 2, and Select Eyes, which are two libraries on their own. In fact, this is actually more like one of the modules we talked about earlier, where the Angular portion actually wraps other libraries. And that's pretty much what we have here. In fact, as you can see, until recently, Select 2 was one of the UI modules, but it's been recently deprecated, and now you should use UI Select instead. So that's what we're going to be looking at in this lesson. I've made a copy of our template here for Select, and let's do bower install angular-ui-select. Now, the select element that we're creating is basically an enhanced drop-down select box like you can do in normal HTML. However, like I said, this will be more enhanced with some interesting features. Of course, this is going to need a theme of some kind, so we're going to go ahead and install Bootstrap as well, so we can use the Bootstrap CSS file. All right, let's go ahead and open up index.html, and let's add some things here. So we want to add our link again, bootstrap.css, but we also, I'm going to copy this, we need another CSS file here, and that is the UI select CSS. So this is going to be public/lib/angular-ui-select/dist and then select.min.css. So these are the two CSS files that we will need to style everything accordingly. Then down here we have Angular, and then we'll also need Angular UI select/dist/select.min.js, and then of course our own app.js. Now let's open up app.js, and of course we will require UI.select as a dependency. And then the other thing we need is some data to work with. Now, the type of select box we're going to be creating works best when you have a lot of data. Let's say you need to choose your country. Well, there are hundreds of countries in the world, and having a select box full of countries, even when they're sorted alphabetically, can be a little tricky to get the right one. And so the UI select allows us to search by beginning to type for it and filtering the results as we go. So what we need is a list of data, as I said, and the data I have is a bunch of employee names and their email. So we have scope.employees, which is an array of objects, and each object has a name and an email address. And I've just pasted this in here so you don't have to watch me type all of this out. Also, since this is a select UI element that we're creating, we're going to need to be able to select a single one of these. And once we do select it, it will be stored in scope.employee, which right now is just an empty object. Okay, so now we can head back to index.html and begin to develop our selection. So we begin by creating an element UI-select, which is the directive that we're given here. This element needs a few attributes of its own. First, it needs ng-model, and this is going to be the model where our value is going to be stored when it's selected. As I said, this is the employee object, and so you might think that we just want to write employee in here just like this. However, it's not a good idea to assign to a single variable like that. The select library recommends that you actually assign it to a property in an object. So we're going to say employee.selected. Now we also need to add a theme, and since we've pulled in Bootstrap, let's go ahead and say that the theme we want to use is Bootstrap. Okay, so now what do we do inside of this UI select? Well, there are two elements that we need to create. First, let's create UI-select-choices. And of course, this is going to be the choices that we want to create. We have our list here as employees, so let's do an ng-repeat here. And we're going to repeat for each, we'll say employee, or actually let's just keep it short and say E in employees. And let's go ahead and filter this by $select.search. And $select here is an Angular variable given to us by this select library. Select.search is whatever value the user is typing into the search box. So as the user is typing, we want to filter all of our choices by what they're typing. And then in here, we want to show the actual text. So we'll say e.name, and then after this, we'll have some parentheses, and inside that, we can say e.email. It was name and email, right? Yeah, name and email. Okay, so that's how we can show our list of choices. But now we need somewhere to show the actual match. So we'll say UI select.match, and this element can display whatever we want. So we again have $select, which is the select object that we're working with here, just as we did down here with select.search, but this time we want select.selected. And select.selected is whatever choice the user ended up selecting. And we're going to display the name. So remember, $select.selected will be whichever one of these objects the user chose. So when we say select.name, we're displaying whichever name comes in that object. Now, we want something to show by default, so let's add a placeholder here, and we can just say enter a name. Okay, and if we open this up in the browser, you can see we're having a problem. And this error message here is pretty cryptic, but if you look closely, you can see that it says it expected repeat expression, but obviously it didn't get that repeat expression. The problem here is I accidentally said ng repeat here, but this should actually just be repeat. We're not using the ng repeat directive here. We should just be setting the repeat attribute, which is something that the select library will use inside to create the different choices. So if I do that and refresh the page, you can see now we have enter a name. So if I click this, two things happen. First, you can see we have a list of all our employees, and I could go ahead and choose any one of them. Now, notice two things here. First of all, when I go through the list here, you can see we have name and then the email address in parentheses. That's coming from our choices here. In fact, you could see this in action if instead of parentheses, we went with a less than sign at the beginning and an ampersand greater than sign at the end, as is sometimes done with email. If I refresh the page now, you can see we have those here in our list. The other thing to note is that when I actually go ahead and select one, we don't see the email address, we just see the name. And that's because of select match here, where we're saying just show the name of the selected item. And we could change this just to see it in action by saying someone is really cool, for example. And now if I go ahead and choose someone, we say Harry Velez is really cool. So you can see all that in action. The one thing we haven't done yet though is searching. So if I refresh this and I click here and I start typing Jason, you can see that we have Jason there. And if I just hit enter, his name will be selected. If I click again and let's say Harry, or I could arrow down and choose Harris instead, and Tommy Harris is selected. One thing to notice though is after I select somebody, for example, let's select Cheryl. If I click on this again to select someone else, Cheryl is automatically deselected and I can go ahead and enter a name. Now, if we would rather Cheryl not be deselected right away, we can add a property to our UI select here. We can say reset search input equals false. And now if I refresh the page and we search for Cheryl here, and then I click on this, you can see that Cheryl is still selected. Actually, what happens is what I typed into the box is kept, and now we're still filtering by what we have. So if instead I just filter by CH and I choose Rodney here, but then I change my mind and click it again, the CH will still be there and I could choose Chelsea instead. So you could go ahead and use that if you want. Of course, there are other options as well that you can set, but this gives you a good idea on how you can use the select box. Now, as I said, this data set that I have here is pretty small, so it may not be a great example of this, but you can use this with much, much bigger data sets. In fact, Angular UI Select can work just fine with huge data sets that you are pulling from the server as you do it, or even with data sets that are not really a hard-coded data set, but as you're typing in here, requests are being made to the server to find things that match to automatically populate this list. One of the examples I've seen is an address search where you can search basically any address in the whole world. I think it uses the Google Maps API as a back end, and that way you can just go ahead and search for any address and it will go to Google Maps and start finding addresses that match what you're typing. So that is pretty cool. And that is Angular UI Select.